The story that I have for you today has two different people named Jean-Marie Lemrise because one was named after the other one. So the story is actually about my great uncle, Jean-Marie or John Lemrise, who was a priest. And so that would be my grandfather's generation. And then my uncle, Jean-Marie Lemrise, was named after his uncle, Jean-Marie Lemrise, and he's the one who actually told me a really great story. We could use junior and senior for them, although it's not like they were father and son or anything like that. And they all lived in Chicago. The Lemrise family moved from Rhode Island to Chicago with, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, Pepe and Mame, deciding to go to Chicago, living in the Saint Jean-Baptiste district, which was around 50th and Halsted, which was primarily French Canadians and Menominee Indians. Everybody spoke French on that block. And that is where Jean-Marie basically grew up because he was the youngest of a family of 13 brothers and sisters. That is 13 who lived. There was another young uncle who died in the influenza epidemic. And so Jean-Marie was one of the youngest of them, and he grew up in Chicago. And then my uncle, John, from my, grandpa and grandma, Aimee and Bibiane Lemrise, he also grew up on that block. So everybody was there, right? And the stories that you have about, is often called Uncle-FatherJean-Marie Lemrise, the elder of these, came down to us from a whole bunch of people, mostly in my mother's generation, because they really loved this guy. So why was that the case? Well, he was one of the youngest of their uncles, and because everybody lived so close, my family, at least in my mother's generation, had kind of a weird relationship. You grew up with, your official mom and dad, but then you had uncles and aunts who'd kind of take care of you like second parents, and your cousins might be as close to you as other people's brothers and sisters were. As a matter of fact, in some branches of the family, they preferred to hang out with other branches of the family rather than their own brothers and sisters. But everyone was living in the same block, so everybody knew what was going on, more or less, with everybody else. So Jean-Marie Lemrise, my great uncle, he decided that he had a vocation. He wanted to be a priest. He had a brother, Arthur, who probably didn't have a vocation, but wound up becoming a priest anyway, and was kind of a sour, bitter guy. And we'll tell you stories about him some other time. Jean-Marie definitely had a calling, and he joined an order called the Claretians, and he was a really great priest, very loving, modeled love, forgiveness, all these values that people hold. And before I launch into the main story, just to give you a few ideas about who this guy was, Vatican II was taking place, the church was kind of opening up, and he embraced that wholeheartedly. I have some of my cousins, my mother's generation of cousins, who would talk about, what a cool priest Father John was and what a cool uncle. And just to give you one example of that, he would take a walk with you. Our family had a farm out in rural Indiana where they would take all the kids out to on weekends and sometimes in the summer to get them out of the dirt and grime and smog of the city. And the cousins spent a lot of time there. There'd always be at least one uncle and aunt there to watch them. And so Father John would go there. And as my mother's generation, her cousins were, teenagers and 20-somethings, he would say, hey, let's go take a walk. And so he'd go walking with Ben or Claude or, Mark or whoever, Albert. And they'd go walking along and he'd say, hey, man, what's going on with your life? Why don't you tell me about your life? What's happening? And then he'd get them to, sort of tell stories and reveal what their anxieties were, where they felt guilty about something. And he'd give them some counsel. And at the very end of the walk, he would say, okay, I'm giving you absolution. Your sins are forgiven. Make the sign of the cross. And they'd be like, I didn't know I was going to confession. And he'd say, well, that's okay. Just say an act of contrition, and here's some penance for you. You got some things off your chest. So he'd do these kind of sneak things. I remember another case at the family reunion, which we used to go to every year, where he decided that he wanted me, he was going to do the Mass, but he wanted me to do a dialogue sermon because he knew that I'd been studying, and he's like, you're up for this, you can do it, here's how I want you to do it. And so, of course, I did it. And he would write me letters when I was a kid. He wrote many people letters. And I remember he had a really cool typewriter that he had access to, which would allow you to print in cursive. And I thought that was so interesting. Anyway, that's enough about side stories. So the story that I heard, this is, of course, secondhand, was from the other Jean-Marie, my uncle, my mother's brother. We had, at that time, bought Uncle Hubert and Aunt Teresa's house. I was in there doing a lot of painting, sprucing it up, and I'd used my inheritance from my mother and father to do that. And so I'm in there working. It's kind of, it's dark. I remember that. I had some lights on. I'm painting around the fireplace. So I'm kind of up on a ladder. And my Uncle John is hanging out with me. And he starts telling me stories. And, Uncle John was a great storyteller himself. He loved to, talk about the family and things happening in the old neighborhood and all that. And he had stayed in Chicago, more or less. He moved out to a suburb called Oak Lawn with his wife, Mary. That's where they had their kids. That's where they lived. They still live there today. And anyway, he was telling me about Father John. So Father John joined the Claretians. And one of the things that a lot of religious people did back then, and not just priests and monks and nuns, but also lay people, they had these things called scapularies. As a matter of fact, we had to wear them in CCD, and also I remember we were given some of these back when I was in a Catholic high school, and they were uncomfortable things to wear. They're essentially like two plastic pictures. There's a picture inside a laminated thing, and they're connected to by strings, and you wear it. So one is on your chest and one is on your back. And one of them is the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the other one is the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So this is kind of Catholic devotional stuff that not that many people do anymore unless they're trad Catholics or, trying to get into that old-fashioned stuff. But it was very common back in, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? So anyway, Father John had to wear a scapulary, and he found it uncomfortable as hell. He didn't like wearing it. He'd always be kind of itching at it, and it would chafe him. But he had to wear it because, you got to follow what your order requires of you. And so Uncle John was telling me, and these are the words that he used. He said, Father John, he used to like to go down to the gin mill. That was his name for a bar, right? Gin mill is where you'd get your cheap drinks and stuff like that. And he'd hang out and, talk with parishioners and all of that. And, they noticed him kind of scratching at the scapulary while he's wearing his priest garments and all that, and they're like, "What's going on there?" And he's like, "It's this scapulary. I don't like it, but I gotta wear it anyway." And so one of the parishioners, and I don't remember exactly who Uncle John said it was, eventually said to him, "Do you have to wear that scapulary?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I've got to have it. I've got to have the Sacred Heart and Immaculate Heart. It's very important. It's something that we do." And then finally, this guy was thinking for a while, and he's like, "But it's just a picture, right? It's just an image. Couldn't you do it in some other way? Like, what if you didn't wear it, but you got it tattooed on you. Like, you could have a tattoo on the front and a tattoo on the back, and they could even tattoo like little lines to represent the cords that hold it. Would that work? And Father John thought about it, and he's like, I don't know. I mean, the worst that could happen is they could say, no, I'll actually ask my superior about that, whether that would be a satisfactory substitute for wearing the scapulary. Because you're right. All that matters is the fact that it's the images of the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Heart. And then he says, but I don't have any money to get a tattoo. As a priest, you don't make any money at all. It all goes back into the order. So I don't think I could do that. And this guy says to him, oh, don't worry about that, Father. If you're willing to get it done, I'll pay for it. If they're going to go for it, I'll pay for it. And so he's like, all right. Well, and then he, drinks his drink and goes out of there. And he talks to his superior. And the superior, thinks for a while. And he's like, well, I mean, I guess that would be okay. But, it doesn't really make sense for you to have it tattooed in your front and in the back. I think what you should do instead is have it tattooed on each shoulder. Because, they would do work outside and be wearing like a tank top or stuff like that. And then, people could see it and it would be a good object of conversation. And, maybe it'll improve other people's devotion or something like that. So Father John goes back to the bar and he says, the superior went for it. What do you think? And the guy's like, yeah, let's get this tattooing done. And so, honest to God, Father John went to a tattoo shop. This guy paid for it. And I don't remember exactly the order, whether it was like the Immaculate Heart on his left shoulder, Sacred Heart on his right shoulder, or vice versa. I don't remember how Uncle John told me the story, but that's what he actually had done. Big images of the Immaculate and Sacred Heart. I've seen those, like when we were at the reunion and he wouldn't be wearing his priest clothes. He'd just be like wearing, a tank top or something like that. You could see these images, and I never quite put two and two together. But he did actually have like a cord that went between each of them. So it was, in fact, a tattooed scapulary. This parishioner paid for it, and from that point on, Father John never had to wear a scapulary underneath his garments ever again. And that's how he did it, And when I heard that story, now I don't have any tattoos. I did think at one point when I was in the Army about maybe getting the Sadler coat of arms tattooed on a shoulder. I never did get any tattoos. If I ever was going to get tattoos, that's what I would get. Not because I'm, particularly given to devotions, certainly not to the Sacred Heart or Immaculate Heart, but it's such a cool story. And Uncle John was such a cool guy, such a real human being that, maybe in his honor, I would actually do that. The main things that have held me back are, I can't see spending the money on tattoos either myself. But it is kind of a cool idea that he did. And it's, a neat story about a guy who was really a priest of the people, Father Jean-Marie Lemrise of the, Claretian order. So I thought, I might share a little bit of that family history with you.